I've turned the page to a new chapter, chapter 28, the West since 1945, and it starts talking about Europe first, then the United States, Canada, Latin America, basically the West, what's going on in the Western world. And I want to say this, most of this history I'm teaching right now, I remember from having lived through it. I was born less than 4 years after World War II ended. So a lot of this stuff I lived through and experienced and went through as a child, as a high schooler, a college student. And I will say this about my college years. I did not keep up with the news at that time. I had to work my way through school. And I didn't keep up with the news very well. But after college, came Watergate, and I took an interest in that, and I started keeping up with the news again. For a while I subscribed to a few news magazines and newspapers. Then I married someone who works for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution at that time. So I get to keep up with the news. Anyway, so we'll start off. France. Again, that's where your book starts from. For many years, the history of France revolved around Charles de Gaulle. De Gaulle became popular because when Germany overran and pounded France, de Gaulle's unit, de Gaulle was a general in the army, de Gaulle's unit was the only one that was able to temporarily stand fast and firm and hold off the Germans for a while. But inevitably, as everybody else was overrun, de Gaulle had to retreat also. De Gaulle fled to Algeria, where he organized a resistance movement that was largely ineffective. I mean, France was whipped. But late in the war, as the Allies moved in and liberated France, de Gaulle became the leader. When the war was over, de Gaulle didn't like the direction France was taking, so he stayed out of politics. But the French people needed a leader, and they finally called him out from retirement. And he led France for several years. De Gaulle had dreams of making France great. But throughout his lifetime, France had been anything but great. About the time he was born, France got clobbered during the Franco-Prussian War. And then in World War I, they had to have help from Great Britain and the United States to hold off the Germans, even though they did win World War I. In World War II, they fought one big battle, and like the Franco-Prussian War, they lost. Blown out of the war after one battle. Then Algeria, they're holding in North Africa, became very restless. De Gaulle fought to hold on to them, but eventually he realized that France had to give up its colony in Algeria. Before that, before Algeria really, France lost to Vietnam. Vietnam was too far away. Basically, these colonial peoples are realizing, hey, Europe is war-torn and they don't want to fight anymore. This is our chance. We've never had a better opportunity. And these colonial people began to move. And one after another, the nations of the world gave up their colonies. Britain had to give up its colonies. The United States gave up the Philippines, even though the other colonies we had did not want to leave, Puerto Rico in particular. Puerto Rico is part of the United States to this day. Alaska and Hawaii eventually were annexed as states. Alaska, I believe, in 1958, and Hawaii in 1959. I might have it backwards, but they were annexed as states. Puerto Rico, there's been talk of annexing it as a state, but we never have. But anyway, France had to give up most of its colonial empire, as did other countries that still had colonies left. All right. Here is basically the story of Europe's history after World War II in one sentence. They embraced socialism, and it failed. Now, folk, they had spent millions of lives defeating Hitler's socialism, Mussolini's socialism, and then once the war was over, the first thing they did was they jumped headlong, you might say head first, into the cauldron of socialism, and they lost miserably. there was a time when it seemed to work. Now, initially, all these economies right after the war, they tended to appear to be very prosperous, but then reality set in. I mean, it's one thing to get a fire lit where there has been no fire for a long time, but then once the fire is lit, the idea is to try to keep it burning or make it hotter. They got their economies up to a certain peak, and then they just simply could not get that up to that, past that peak. As for de Gaulle, when he became president, the first thing he did was demand that the French give the president more power. A very dangerous move, to say the least. Reminds you of Adolf Hitler, even though de Gaulle was no Hitler. But he demanded that the French give him more power, which he did. The power of the presidency was greatly increased. De Gaulle ran France for a while. Then he told the French about riots erupted, student unrest, and I'm old enough to remember in 1968, while our students in the United States were rioting like crazy, the French students also started rioting. In the case of the United States, most of our rioting had to do with Vietnam. There were other issues, race also, but mostly Vietnam. The French could not riot over Vietnam, they were out of it. But they rioted over such things as poverty and lack of jobs. Again, the problem was that the French government controlled all the coal mines. The French government controlled all the factories. There was no privatization of their industries. And everybody was paid equally. And everybody was guaranteed a job. Well, hey, if you're guaranteed a job and going to be paid the same, why not shirk all you can? And this is the problem that socialism has never been able to overcome. It destroys incentive. I mean, hey, I'm going to get paid whether I work or not. I'm going to have a job whether I work or not. Well, hey, why not loaf off? And the whole system just comes crashing, tumbling down. To get some of the work done, also, these countries had another problem. Your book is about talking about. The war had carried away millions of their young men and a lot of their women too. And then after the war, there came a sentiment to cut population, reduce population. Well, this was probably the worst thing you could have done. When they found they didn't have enough human power to man their factories and keep their infrastructure going, they called in foreigners, mostly Muslim. Called in Muslims, and the Muslims were let to live in the worst part of town and given the worst jobs. The Muslims began rioting, and the government officials then promised measures to make things a little bit more equal. Your book says for many Muslims, the joblessness went beyond 50% in a lot of Muslim communities. And again, a lot of the French people would rather the Muslims would go back home or go somewhere else because they say, well, you're no longer needed here. That problem is still going on, by the way.